Today we're working on finishing up the tabletop. We'll get all the clamps off, clean up a little bit of the glue, cut it down to dimensions, and then flatten it. This glue up has been sitting for about a week. So let's get these clamps off and see how it turned out. And here it is. We know that we have a little bit of a misalignment here on this middle board, but if we pull up the square, we can see that middle board is high, but the rest are pretty close. Check a couple spots here. It's pretty close. It's not bad at all. I'm really happy with how this turned out. The next step will be scraping off some of this glue, marking final dimensions, and then cutting out to just over final dimensions so we can start to flatten it. Since we're going to be cutting this down, I want to make sure that the glue that's on the edges here doesn't interfere with the track saw. So I'm just going to come through here with a chisel and cut off a little bit of this glue. When you're doing this step, you don't want to gouge the wood at all. We need to save all of the thickness that we can. So I'm not digging down into the wood at all to get this glue off. I'm just running it along the top. I'm not too concerned with a little bit of glue. The underside of the track saw is kind of foam, rubber, anti-skid stuff, so it can work with a little bit of this. Making sure your final tabletop is square is very important. So we know that this table needs to be 28 by 18. It's at 30 by almost 21, 20 and 3/4. So we know we need about an inch off each end and then 3 inches from the width. So about 1.5 inches on each side here. So I'm going to use this square to mark my first corner. The first point is the easiest because you can kind of put it anywhere. I'm thinking about these parts I want to cut off. I think I'm going to flip it around and start on the other side. I know for sure I want to try to cut as much of this off as possible. I'm not too concerned about these two boards being even. I think it's going to end up being close. So I'm going to start with the square, kind of eye it up here so it looks like it's straight going this direction. And then I'm going to see how much I can get cut off on this side. One tip I have is, though we know we need to get 1 inch off both of these ends, you don't have to get 1 inch off both ends. So you can start by making your first line or your first cut with the length as close to this end as you want. As long as it's square, then you'll have a nice straight edge to measure the exact distance off from this side. So I'm going to get pretty close to this end. I'm going to adjust it this way a little bit. And I'm thinking right about here is where I'm going to put my first line. When I'm making this first line in the measurements, I'm going to go a little outside of my final dimensions, so I have a little room to play with in case I need to make some final adjustments. So if this is my anchor side, I can take this line straight out, align the square, and take it straight out the end of the glue up. So that gives me two perfectly straight lines in a 90-degree that I can then use the square to ensure I have a 90 going the other direction. I'm going to do the same thing in the other direction, so I'm going to spin it around, align the square with this line, and then I'm going to use my tape measure to get a rough guess around 18 and a half. Right about there. So I'm going to try to keep the square at this point, at that distance, then I'm going to remeasure. I'm going to measure at a couple spots here. Okay, that's 18.5. Our final dimension is 18, so that gives me a little bit of room to cut off later. Then I'm going to take this line out to the edge as well. It's important that we get these measurements as close to perfect as possible. I noticed my line was off a little bit, so I'm going back and remarking. So now I can measure 28.5 this way. That gives me a little room to adjust later if I need to. And with those two marks, I'll be able to draw a line off the square for this end. Now we can use the square to check that each of these angles is at a 90. That one's good. This one's good as well. Good. That one's good too. So the final step for the perfect right angle here is to measure the diagonals. This one is just over 34. And so is this one. So it's pretty much perfectly square with a 1/4 inch extra the whole way around that I'll go back and cut down. And with this, we're ready to get the first cuts made on this glue up and then start to flatten. To make these cuts, I'm going to be using a track saw. These clamps are what hold the track to the piece of wood you're cutting. They fit right into this groove, just like this. They slide back the track until they reach the piece, and then you can clamp the track directly to the piece. Now I'm lining up the edge of this track with where I want to cut. Consider the width of the blade. And then I'll pull these clamps over under the piece and then clamp them down. Now this track is fastened securely to the glue up, and we're ready to make our cut. Here's that first cut, perfectly straight every single time with the track saw. Now that we have the glue up cut to just outside final dimensions, we're going to use the belt sander to do the flattening. This belt sander does a great job, takes off a lot of material, and does a good first pass of flattening, and then last we'll hit it with the orbital sander to get it to final grit. Between each of the sanding passes, I'm going to use the square to make sure it's flat, check it at multiple spots, and then mark the high spots. So that really helps with ensuring that it's flat in both directions, long ways and width. Simple marks with a pencil show the high spots, and then we just go back and hit it with the sander after that. Now we have a flat tabletop. From here, I'm going to cut into final dimensions, cutting off the last little bits of things that I can, and then we'll work on the finished sanding. And here it is. Final dimensions, flat, and ready for sanding. I was really able to get out that edge. There's nothing here, it's perfectly flat. And we still got most of 2 inches, which is really great. I'm really happy with where these knots turned out. I think that'll be really cool. I'll do a 1/2 inch round over bit or a 1/4 inch round over bit along the corners. I mean, like, it's just perfectly pristine corners. Everything looks really good. It's a couple little pieces to fill in here and get these knots cleaned out, filled in. Some on the other side as well. I'm really curious to see how this turns out. I think this will be really cool. Before we get to sanding this, I'm going to do the 1/4 inch roundover bit with the router around the outside of the top and the bottom of this glue up. From there, we'll get the orbital sander and work on bringing this to final grit, probably 240, maybe 400. We'll see where we land with the marks from the belt sander. Once I get both sides sanded, I'll work on the apron and the legs. Once the base is done, then we'll polyurethane everything, put it together, and it'll be good to go. Got one little apprentice mark right here. Do a little bit of sanding there, and I think that'll be good. The rest of it looks really good. There are a bunch of these little knots and cracks throughout this wood, so I'm going to go ahead and work on cleaning these out, filling them in a little bit with some super glue. So super glue trick to kind of looks like epoxy, but helps fill in these gaps and lets the polyurethane have something to sit on top of. I've got this tabletop sanded down to 120 grit. Part of the process of getting a good sand is to wet the wood. It's called raising the grain. So when you get a little bit of water on the tabletop, the wood soaks up the water and then dries quickly. That raising of the grain allows you to sand that part down and makes it even smoother. So that's what I'm going to do now. You don't need to get it very wet, just damp. Now I'm going to let it dry just like this. Then I'll come back and sand it again at 120, and then I'll move up to probably 320, and then do the same process again. I've got the tabletop sanded down to 320 grit. I've done grain raising between each grit, and it is looking good. You can start to see some shine even on it, that it's super smooth. This will be the top. Got all these knots filled in. So we're just about there. Now that I've finished sanding this tabletop on all sides, I'm going to hit it with a tack cloth, and then we're going to use this to mock up the base. I'm going to use the underside for the mock up so we don't ding up the top. Once the base is mocked up, I'll get everything dry fit together. Then I'll finish with sanding the base and putting the polyurethane top coat on all the pieces. I've recut the legs, so I'm going to plane these down to the right thickness and dimension, and then we're going to cut the tapers. Alright, now we're going to cut the tapers on the legs. This is the taper jig. There's a couple hold down clamps that hold the piece in place. We put the table saw at a 45, and you can see that when we cut it, it cuts that perfect 45 taper. I'll set a marker here to ensure that each one is the same. Now that the leg tapers are cut, I'm doing a dry fit here to see just how everything's going to fit together. I have the legs placed 1 inch inside each of the corners, and I have the apron pieces placed in here as well. Before I sand the pieces of the base, I'm going to use the Craig jig and drill the pocket holes that'll hold all of this together. I have this simple Craig jig. It works really well for this type of work to drill the pocket holes. On the back here, you set the thickness of the piece that you're drilling into, and that ensures that you don't drill through. In the case, you set this collar at the same depth, and that's set to 3/4 as well. So this is ready to go. This jig is really easy to use. I'm just going to clamp it right to the edge of the board here, and then I'm going to align the Craig jig side up with the side of the board. And then I'll run a quick clamp here, and then I'll place this on the workbench and drill out the rightmost hole here. And I'm going to do the same thing to the other side, then the other side of the board, and then all the other apron boards in the dry fit. With all the holes drilled, now it's time to sand. So we're going to sand each of these base pieces down to the final grit to match the tabletop. Once that's done, I'll start driving screws, make sure everything's aligned, and then prepare for the top coat. The sanding is now done. It took about 8 hours to get everything sanded, the tabletop and the base. Now what we're going to do is use the Craig screws to fasten this base together. The holes are prepared, and I'm using a clamp here, one of these long clamps, to hold this together while I insert the screws. I've measured about 1/2 inch between the outside of the leg and the apron board. That matches the previous project, so the styles will align. Using these Craig screws is pretty simple. They fit right into the bit that's provided, and you just drive them into the hole, and the head of the screw stops before it pushes too far through. Using the clamp makes sure everything is tight while we're doing this, and this workbench tabletop is perfectly flat, so I don't have to worry about any warping or anything while I'm screwing these down. It's important to work on a flat surface, and if I didn't have this, I would use the tabletop that I made earlier that I know is flat. Alright, those first 4 screws are in, so I can loosen this clamp, and we have the first part of our base. And just like that, the base is done. We still need to do the top coat on the base and the tabletop, but first I want to mount the base to the tabletop and get a good look at what this thing looks like. There's a lot of ways you can mount your base to your tabletop. In this case, I'm just using the Kreg screws in the pocket holes that I drilled earlier. I'm keeping these a little loose because I'm going to remove this base to do the top coat, but let's take a look at this. Here it is. This is our first time seeing an almost finished version of this coffee table. I think it looks really good. I do have one knot right here that I couldn't really cut around with the wood that I have, so I tried to put it right in the middle and kind of make it a centerpiece. The tabletop turned out really nice. I'm really happy with how this looks, and I can't wait to get the polyurethane top coat on it and see how it really pops. Our last step will be doing the top coat on the entire piece. So I'm going to get this disassembled and ready for that last step.